Welcome, week one, EDU121 Critical Thinking for Effective Learning. I don't know what it's like there weather-wise. We've just had rain suddenly pouring down, lightning outside, etc. And so I don't know what that says about the world that we're in. Is it dry or wet in Sydney at the moment?
We're in Newcastle, but very wet.
Very wet? Newcastle. Wonderful. That's such a lovely spot there too. I must come down and visit. Let's begin with a Bible reading. So we're assuming a Christian perspective as we go. Certainly I'm motivated by my Christian perspective, but I've also taught in secular schools and with Scripture Union and chaplaincy, so I'm aware that there are different perspectives. But let's begin with a Bible reading from my perspective. 1 Corinthians 3. Do not deceive yourselves. If anyone think you are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools or humble so that you may become wise. And to me, this speaks to me of whenever we're very proud about what we know or doing, then we're in danger. We need humility. And verse 19, the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. And that doesn't include all of the world, but there is a worldly approach that can be foolish. As it's written, He, God, catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise are futile, so no more boasting. So there's a real emphasis on humility there in 1 Corinthians 3, as Paul writes to the Corinthian church. I visited ancient Corinth at one stage, and it's fascinating to think where Paul was living there, and there's quite a bit of remains of the ancient town from 2,000 years ago. A prayer from St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom, pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect, dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion, we pray. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you, the Father, forever and ever. Can we just take a couple of thoughts as we start from Madeline and then Josie? What are some of the things you're hoping to get out of this class? Because you're probably studying 3 or 4 other classes that are a bit similar and foundational as well. And maybe you're even doing 4 subjects as well as teaching for a day or so as well. But Madeline, Josie, what are you hoping to get from this class?
I think for me, I've just sort of been looking at it at if it's critical thinking, I just want to know what that looks like a lot more, how I can be a critical thinker and how that might change how I might do things in the classroom, or how I could be teaching in a way that students can become critical thinkers.
Yeah, so helping you to think well, helping the students to think well, and that's a major part of what we do. Madeline, your thoughts?
I think there's been a lot of assumptions, but also change recently in the education sector. And I think it's great at the beginning of the degree to develop our own critical thinking skills, because I don't want to just accept things as they come, even in the other units that we're going to be doing, because we've seen so much change. So there's different ways of doing things. And I think once upon a time it was, this is the way that you teach, this is the way that they learn. And to know that, no, I can ask the big questions, I can challenge assumptions, I can evaluate my own thinking on things going into the rest of my subjects for this degree. I think that's a cool place to start.
Yeah, and so the great thing about this course is you have a chance to look at some big scholarly insights and studies on the nature of education, and you can build on that from the beginning. So you're going down the right pathway, as you say, Madeline. I think that's really true. And then as Christians, we're also interested in the whole person. And so I think that's another important aspect to begin with, rather than narrow it down. Shyla and Stephanie and Jasmine, what are you hoping to get from the class?
Oh, sorry.
You go.
I can't see everyone. Hang on, I'm going to get everyone up so I actually know when someone starts talking. I think that this year, I mean, I've kind of briefly touched on critical thinking before, but it hasn't been in depth. So I think I'm excited to really go in depth about what critical thinking really is, and then some like practical ways I can use it in the classroom.
Love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think critical thinking is not something that I do particularly well. So I'm interested to get some strategies and some insight into how I can do that in both my like everyday life, my own educational journey, and then how I can apply that in a classroom to a range of different students and their different like learning styles and personalities. Yeah,
That's great. Shyla.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. My computer was saying that my audio was not connected and I needed an administrator's password, so I wasn't sure if it was. Sorry if my voice is a bit bad. I'm sick. I think that I'm very normally someone that will take something at face value. So I feel like this will sort of challenge me to push past like just what I'm taught and what I'm told, like what Madeline said. I just think it'll be an interesting thing for me to have to do, because I'm very I like obedience and doing what I'm told and knowing that I'm getting things right, rather than pushing for more innovative ideas, which is something I should be doing as a teacher. So I'm looking forward to learning that.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to interacting with each one. I think that's terrific. I think we'll gain a great deal out of this class, and also out of this subject that we're looking at. You can get in touch at any time through the email there, sam.hay@ac.edu.au, and then my private email too, drsam@gmail, if you have any difficulty with the other email. And so there are classes on Monday, Wednesday and Thursday, but this class is for this particular group on Thursday. Over on the Moodle website, you'll have some details about the subject, and also you'll also have an introduction to me and an opportunity to put up an introduction from yourselves as well with the other students. I've put a video up that gives a bit of my background that you'll be able to see on the Moodle website. And so I was school teaching after leaving university for about 12 to 15 years, mainly in science, maths. I just love the idea of science and dissecting frogs and doing chemistry and all of that. And I love teaching students about science and mathematics. I also thoroughly enjoyed, together with the humanities. And then over the years, I've tended to go more into the humanities, history and social science. I then, out of my interest in teaching and leading people in Christian things, was a youth leader, then a church pastor, and then a school chaplain in schools for about 4 years with Scripture Union. And then more recently, I've been teaching tertiary, including biblical studies, as well as education and other subjects as well. So there's a bit more about me there. And then I look forward to getting to know each of you. So I encourage you to put up a introduction there as well. You'll find a subject outline on the Moodle webpage that introduces the subject. I encourage you to read through that. It's from about a year or two back, and so we keep to those guidelines, and certainly the learning outcomes are very much the same. We're looking at ways we know. We're also looking at the fields of knowledge and different ways of interpreting what we know as true. And then the graduate attributes that we're looking to develop: a sound Christian worldview, integrity and justice, leadership, ability and communication, and personal and social skills, and particularly with a focus on creative and critical thinking. And so there are various strategies that we will be using there. So I encourage you to read through those details and think about how we think. One of the things that'll be a little bit different is the content and sequencing. We've moved them around just a little bit, but they certainly still line up totally here as well. And so I've put up a second content and sequencing page called the lecture schedule there, which will show what we're covering each week. So we begin today by introducing thinking skills, and then next week we have Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greeks. They tell us about their view of how we know and what we know. And so we'll be looking at these ancient views which still influence us. Week 3, Christian views that continue to influence how we know, and then through history, the Enlightenment and development of different ways of thinking. And then we move into the fields of knowledge, maths and science, language. And then week 8, particularly important, will be emotion. Week 7 on language reminds us that we know because we use language. And one of the interesting things there is if a person had an accident and their brain stopped its capacity to use language, what sort of knowing would they have? Anyone got a thought on that? You have an accident, you lose your capacity for language. What sort of knowing would the person have? And I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago where a doctor who works with comatose patients in Belgium has this problem quite often. They bring into his hospital people who've had damage to the language section of their brain. And so he has to work with these sort of people. Someone got a thought on that? How would you know? Can I ask Noah? He's looking very thoughtful. What sort of knowing do you think a person would have if they lost the language part of their brain?
Like as in the ability to, like, yeah, you can hear me. Yeah, is like the ability to understand language or the ability to speak the language?
Probably both, and certainly both can happen. Probably more common is the loss of the ability to speak the language. But what I think is more challenging is those comatose patients or injured patients that can't even contemplate or think with language. What are your thoughts on that, Noah?
Oh, I think it's interesting because it's kind of asked the question, where in the brain do the thoughts occur, and where is the line between conscious and subconscious thought, and where does it cross that line between what we want to do and then what we end up doing, and then what we want and then what we know we want. And so it's just kind of interesting, like where in the brain is there, and does it have to do with the like translation of actions between one hemisphere to the other through the corpus callosum? Does that have anything to do with that in terms of, you know, language on one side and understanding, you know, kind of split down the middle? If that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And what they found was that they got people to think of, say, playing tennis or swimming, etc., and different parts of their brain lit up. And so even though the person was largely in a coma, they could see parts of the brain light up, and so they could get yes, no answers from the person, you want to continue living, etc. And what they found was that in 30% or more of cases, people who were comatose and would have been dismissed as no longer thinking were actually still thinking. And this has led them to give painkillers and other help to people who are comatose, even though there is a tendency to ignore them. So there's been a lot of research going on in that area. Noah, you raised the point of left and right brain, and people have had accidents where they've been split, and they get people to use their right hand and left hand, which I think are connected to the opposite side. Can you remember which parts of the brain are more left and which parts are more right? So I think logic and language is left and feeling right. Do you remember some thoughts on that?
I'm not too sure about that, but I wasn't sure if I had heard that that's actually kind of been disproved.
Yeah.
That it's not like specifically one side is analytical and one's creative, but rather like the left hemisphere kind of crosses over to the right side of the body and vice versa. But yeah, I think, you know, the brain is more of a whole. It doesn't necessarily one side's more creative than the other.
Yeah, very well said. And in education, it's very dangerous to label half of your students as feeling people and half as thinking people.
That's right.
Because all use both. So it's very dangerous to do that sort of labeling. But it's also fascinating and interesting that different people may prefer one or the other, and even in different situations. You know, a person who's logical at work may be very feeling and emotive and take up art or poetry at home. And so, different situations can bring out different sides. So in week 7, we're going to look at the language part of the brain, which is so important. And then week 8, we're going to look at the emotional side of the brain, because the other thing is that some people a lot more emotive. And as you've said, Noah, we're all emotive in some ways. And if the fight or flight kicks in, so if you're a student in a classroom and you're sitting next to little Johnny that you're worried he's going to poke you at any stage, you won't be able to concentrate because the emotions are kicking in all the time. So when it comes to thinking, emotions are particularly important. Week 9, we'll look at ethics, good and evil, what's going on in the brain there. Week 10, discrimination and equality. Week 11, we'll look at group thinking, and then we go on and consider politics. And then week 12, we draw it all together and we look at faith again in week 12, us first looking at faith in week 3. So let me know if there's any questions about the topics that we're looking at each week. So today we're going to go on and look at Edward de Bono. We're going to look at different activities there as well. One of the things that we might start looking at here, I'll just remind you of a couple of things about thinking. But before we start, can I get a few students to tell me, what do we mean by thinking? So Matilda and then Josiah, what do you think we mean by thinking? I see a panicked look on Matilda's face, so that indicates that emotion has kicked in here.
Yeah. So, oh man, sorry, I'm so nervous. That's okay. So thinking is what our brain does, obviously. Man, yeah, sorry, I'm not really good to answer this question.
No, that's great. And then moving on to Josiah. And I like what you say there, Matilda, about what our brain does. So one of the interesting things that we could do is look further at neurons and hemispheres of the brain. And there's a whole study area there that you may be interested in. And we could look further at that. Josiah, what's happening when we're thinking?
Look, pretty big question. I'm going to say it's our interpretation of the firing of neurons and hormones within our body.
Wow, that is very scientific, with the neurons, with the hormones there in the body. You've got to be careful of that approach if you see someone that you're attracted to and you want to invite them out on a date and you say, there are hormones moving in my bloodstream and I'm drawn. So you've got to be careful of that scientific approach. Maybe you need more of the humanities and poetry in a situation like
I'm an
that.
English teacher, so
Yeah, that's right. So Aidan and Gabriel, what are your thoughts on thinking? What's happening when we're thinking?
I'm guessing that's me then. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
what do you
thanks,
guys
Aidan.
think?
Sorry. Yep.
I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't really know, just because I hear, so the last course I did
Yes.
on this type of thing was focusing on the like spiritual and non-chemical side of thinking. So while there's that chemical side, I'm still kind of grappling with the side that is more than logical, tied to emotion, and I guess experience is the best word for it.
And they're very important points that we've raised. And the very neuroscience scholar who was talking on comatose patients that he was working with said exactly that. There is so much that we don't know that's going on. And he even said when people pass from this life to the next, he said it's an unanswerable question, because we just see people smiling, seeing a hope before them, moving on, and then we don't know what happens. And he said there are unanswerable sides of thinking, and there's spiritual aspects of it and experience. And next week we're looking at Socrates, and Socrates says we've got to keep asking questions. So that response, we don't know, is a very valuable and valid response. Yep. Other thoughts?
I kind of can cheat a little bit because I was on here yesterday for a bit.
Yes.
But one of the things I did was I looked it up, and it said that it was the person that is not the physical. And that really made me interested. And I had a conversation with my housemate the other day about how the soul is what makes us up, but thinking really is what makes us more than just dirt and water, in my mind.
That is excellent. So it's in our mind, and over the next few weeks, we'll look next week at the Greek idea. And someone would tell me, what do the Greeks think of the nature of the human person, body, soul, and spirit? Someone got any thoughts on the Greek view of the human person as body, soul, and spirit? So often they wanted to break things apart and analyze what people were made up of. And so to do that, they would think of the person as a body, soul, and spirit. Josiah, do you have any knowledge of the Greek view of dividing a person up into body, soul, and spirit?
It's pretty limited, but I'm pretty sure it's where the Bible verse, follow God with your heart, mind, and spirit, originated from, because the New Testament was very much in the area of Greece. But basically, I feel like to understand humanities, philosophers kind of tried to compartmentalize and said your body was the physical, which you could do your actions with, your soul was the emotions, and where you experience things, and the spirit was the metaphysical, being what would go into the afterlife, being what would continue eternally.
Yeah, so that's one view that Greeks had, and the Apostle Paul, who's moving in Corinth and Ephesus and Greek-speaking worlds, Thessalonica and others, and Athens, he may have considered that view. A lot of the Hebrew Old Testament has a more holistic view which integrates them, and so we're a holistic whole, as opposed to the Greek view that it's the spirit that survives. The Hebrews believe that God raises the body as well, and so that we're an integrated whole in the life to come. And so there are these different views, and New Testament scholars today often discuss resurrection in terms of a holistic resurrection, which gives expression to our spirit, whereas the Greeks tend to view the spirit as that which is like air and breath and the pneuma that animates us and gives us life. So that raises a lot of challenging questions. But as teachers, that reminds us that there is a lot more going on in thinking. That is, people are reminded that they're a physical person waiting for morning tea or lunch. They're reminded that they're a physical person and little Johnny sitting next to them can poke them and they can feel pain. They're a physical person with ADHD who wants to get around and run around the classroom rather than sit still. And so there's a lot going on in the teaching environment that reminds us that we're more than just a brain on a stick, as James K.A. Smith says. So how many people have read anything by James K.A. Smith about habits? And he goes on to, I think, say that we are a heart on a stick rather than a brain on a stick, perhaps. It's our habits and our attitudes that influence us. So we're going to look at that next week a little bit, is the Greek view of how we know, and then weeks following we look at Christian views, and then we came to Rene Descartes, and he said, anyone able to tell me about Rene Descartes? Aidan, have you come across Rene Descartes at all?
I was so afraid you're going to ask me, because no, I have no idea who that is.
That sounds good. Madeline, any thoughts on Rene Descartes? So about 1700s, he said, I think, therefore I am. But as a Catholic Christian, he would also say that God thinks and therefore he is. But we have the thinking part of our body, and then we have our body. So he divides us into two, so we could think about that. And I think since the 1700s, a lot of thinkers have tended to see our brain as separated from our body, whereas Hebrew Christians would say that the brain and body are integrated. And so there are these different views of how we understand the human person. And then since the 1800s, we've done a lot of brain science, and then a lot of people have reduced the person to the material. So you are your neurons, and at the end of life, then it all ceases. But then after that, in the 1900s, people have said, hang on, I'm more than my neurons. I'm an agent who takes responsibility, who actively thinks. And so through the 1900s, there's been a rediscovery of the whole person. And then since the 1960s and 70s, in the postmodern world, we've had a rediscovery of emotions and thinking, and everyone's got out their guitars and drums, and we now live in an experiential world, perhaps. And so different decades place a different emphasis on how we understand the human person. But I think the important thing from a teaching perspective is to understand that we are a holistic person that includes body, soul, spirit, mind, everything, including the social world around us. And in the Western world, we often focus on you and I as a thinking person. But I think if you go to Eastern countries or Japan or Asian countries, often a thinking person is thinking within community. That is, there's a social thinking. And in your second assignment, you're going to be asked to think on your worldview. How do you think as a Western modern person? And you can think about these questions. How do we understand the brain and thinking and the mind? And then in the third assignment, you're going to be asked to think about two other ways of thinking: Indigenous thinking, or thinking from another religious tradition, or thinking from an atheistic, non-Christian tradition. So these are big questions, because it's important as a teacher that you understand yourself, how you think, what you think about thinking, how you think about life and eternal life. And it's important that you understand other viewpoints that are different to you. So that's what we're going to be doing in assignment 2 and in assignment 3. So just a little bit about thinking. And here, I've got a couple of puzzles on thinking for you to think about. And these puzzles remind us that we often make assumptions. But let me go to this one here. Is this painting good art? So can I get a couple of people to tell me what's going on as you think about this question? Is this good art? And so
I would say, I was just going to come forward and say,
yeah, good, Matilda.
I love art. It's amazing. And I think this is amazing art because personally, I've tried to recreate certain art pieces and it has failed. And so this takes a lot of skill. But the fact that it's actually resembling, well, from what I'm seeing it as, it's a man and he looks quite, his emotion is quite angry and he looks like he's probably about 55 to 60 years old. And it brings forward so many emotions there where I'm thinking this guy is probably a soldier and he's maybe guarding something, or it's just really bringing forth my imagination as to what's going on in this picture. And so that's
great. And that shows that art is not just about what the artist does, but it's about the response that it brings out in the viewer. And so there's a lot in that concept. That is, the viewer is involved, and this brings out emotions. And this takes us beyond thinking that's 2 + 2 = 4 to thinking that is communicating emotions as poetry does, as literature does. And so thinking can involve all of these emotions. And this has led scholars to say that thinking is often involving more than what we are deliberately setting out to do. It involves the subconscious, it involves feeling, it involves our body responses. And so if our body's telling us something, if our eyes are telling us something, then thinking involves so many different things going on. And in teaching, we have to remember, even though we're saying students pay attention, 2 + 2 = 4, a third of the class may be deliberately thinking of 2 + 2 = 4, but then another third of the class are worried about what's going on around them. And so there are a lot of other things that are going on with the people all around them. And so we have to be aware of the different things that are going on. So some models of understanding thinking and consciousness. We've said there is the embodied mind, the Hebrew understanding of the whole person. There's the Asian view, if I can say that, of the person in community. So you're in a family, you're in community, and when you think, you are concerned about what the whole family thinks, what the whole community thinks, what the society thinks. And so that's quite different to our individualist way of thinking. Whereas Rene Descartes, and so Rene Descartes, he separates the person into mind and body, and he did a lot of great mathematical work on Cartesian geometry. But when he's thinking about the person, is this a good way to go to separate the mind and spirit from the body? The Greeks were also doing something similar. Let's briefly consider Sigmund Freud. In 1820 in Denmark, when you studied psychology in Denmark, then you would, like Søren Kierkegaard in Denmark, when he studied psychology at university, he had to read the Bible and think about the formation of the whole person, because that was part of what thinking was about in 1820, the formation of the whole person. So that's psychology in 1820. By the time we get to 1880, people have decided psychology's got to get scientific. let's ring bells and see if dogs salivate. Let's look at measuring how people respond. And so we've got 1820, a holistic psychology. And then by the 1880s, we've got psychology, which has now become scientific. We measure the thinking of the brain, and it's all about how people respond. But Sigmund Freud, around the 1820s or so, he's saying, surely a lot of thinking is what's going on in the subconscious. And so Freud proposed that you're not just a thinking calculator on a stick, there's a lot more going on inside. And just like the ancient Greeks, they thought that the person is like a constitutional monarch who's ruling over the body, ruling over the emotions, ruling over everything that's going on in different parts of the body. And there can even be people out in the society that influence your thinking. You just got to say yes. Have you noticed with Asian people, if you say, is this good, etc., there are some Asian people who will always just say, yes, it's beautiful. And that's because they don't want to offend you, do they? And that's because they're responding to groupthink rather than to individual think. Whereas you ask an Australian, is this beautiful? They'll just tell you what they think, won't they? Because Australians got a different view of the world. So the Greeks thought thinking was like a man on horseback who's told to, you got a black horse, there's all the good thoughts and, all the bad thoughts, you know, your desires and anger. And then you've got a white horse, which is all the good thoughts, said the ancient Greeks. And then you're the person on the chariot who makes decisions about which horse does what. So that's a Greek view of the human person. You've got the spirit, soul, and body. Any thoughts about these as to why one might be better than the other? Which one do you prefer? Stephanie, any thoughts on whether you prefer a Hebrew holistic or a Greek or a modern view of thinking? Any thoughts, Stephanie, on which one's a good way of thinking about thinking?
I think it takes a lot for me to wrap my head around.
Yes.
I think they all have merit, and particularly in different contexts as well. You know, way back when they were taking what they could see, what they could think of. They didn't have necessarily modern science and that sort of thing, which kind of affects the way that we think things. I like the holistic view. I think it's, yeah, that's probably the one that I most understand at this point. Yeah, I think they're very interesting. I suppose with Freud's one, the three agencies, I guess there's different situations where each is more applicable. Yeah, I don't know. It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and I like the way you say there is a lot to think about, but there is benefit in the holistic view. And there's a danger if you go to one type of psychologist or you go to a chemist, they will tell you that it's all about chemistry. And if you go to a biologist, he'll tell you it's all about certain biology. So every expertise will give a different view. Josie, what are your thoughts on which might be a better view?
I think I'm very similar to Steph. I think that because everyone's so different, people are going to perceive things in different ways. I think because people have been used to a certain way of thinking, maybe even subconsciously, they're not going to think that one way is better or the other. I think that a holistic view or a like the Hebrew understanding of a whole person, I think is something that makes sense to me more than the Greek view and things like that. I haven't really thought about that specifically.
That's great. Over to the SPCEF group. What are your thoughts on which is the better approach? And we've almost got a group approach here. We could have three views from SPCF.
That's us. We're the group. I wouldn't say that, as it's been said before, I wouldn't say there's any better method, I'd say that it comes down to the cultural understanding and perspective that they're taking. So obviously the Hebrew, their belief about the body, the soul, the spirit, that'd be all interconnected into their faith. So they would definitely have an element of truth, definitely to all of it, just the same as holistic would have an element of truth. But the reality is we're never going to understand the full extent of how intricately created we are. So I think it's great for us to know what we can know, study what we can study, and yeah.
And I think that's so important to know what we can know, to study what we can study, so we actually gain more importance. So we might do some study of neuroscience and then admit what we don't know. And so I think that's so important, is to humbly admit, and that's important to bring authenticity to the students and to say, I don't know all the answers to this, don't have time to give the answer today, I'll tell you tomorrow. And then we go home and we madly Google it. We might look it up on Wikipedia, but we can't quote Wikipedia in our assignment, so we don't do that. We look for something that's scholarly with 50 references on it, and then come back, etc. Any other thoughts from the SPCF room?
I think that's exactly where I'm at right now, bringing, I feel like I need to go away and research all of this. I'm a bit slow in my thinking, and I need to go away and process and read up on stuff to fully take things in. So I feel like I don't really have a stance on this at this point, that I need to go home and chew over and mull over and look into a bit more.
Yeah. One thing that really strikes me is the importance of networking, and I can see that looking at the three of you there, is that you have an opportunity to talk to people around you. When we talk about groupthink in around about week 10, there's a real danger in the group that you're a part of. So if the SPCF group have been talking about conspiracy theory for the half hour before they came online, and they're on the side of certain US former presidents, and they doubt all sorts of things that are going on in the world, groupthink really is quite challenging. And one of the real challenges is that we tend to believe what we hear. And so if the people around us have been saying something over and over again, then we tend to believe that. And so thinking is often shaped by the society around. And so we need to stand up to ideas. And this is what Martin Luther did in 1500. He stood up to the ideas of the leaders of his day. And sometimes we need to follow our conscience, and sometimes we need to gather more information. And so Freud had the idea that some people say we are the ego, and then we listen to our id and superego. Is anyone able to tell me what's wrong with that thought? That you are your ego, you are the I, you're the conscious person, and you listen to your subconscious. Someone able to tell me what's wrong with that thought?
It feels like it's completely removing any form of spirituality.
Exactly. So you're also a spiritual person. What's wrong though if we say we are just your spirit? What's wrong with that thought?
Then we're completely removing ourselves, and we're not taking on any responsibility ourselves.
And you're removing the embodied part of yourself. That is, if you feel pain, that's you. And so I think the Hebrew idea that includes the whole person is healthier. And so many people would say the ego is the active part of the person which makes decisions regarding agency. And so the ego is where decisions are made, but you are also your subconscious. You've got to admit that at times you get angry. You got to admit that you've got some bad experiences stored in your subconscious, and these can rise up and influence you. You've got bad habits. And the superego, according to Freud, is influenced by your parents and the good thoughts they gave you, and influenced, if you're a Christian, by God giving a source of good thoughts into your mind. Anyone got any thoughts on Freud's theory of these three parts? Do you like it, or are you suspicious of it?
So really quickly, superego.
Yep.
That's anything that comes from outside of our own personal experience.
Yes, but it gets built into you from when you're an infant after you're born. And
Okay.
it could even be innate in there before you're born, in the genetics. And so conscious could be there. And evolutionists would say that it could be bred into us over a huge period of time to favour love and to favour caring for people. So it's all the positive, good things that are at the higher level of thinking is Freud's superego, whereas the id is all the lower things. Any other thoughts on Freud's theory? Certainly the id can be the fastest responding part, the fight and flight. So that kicks in very quickly when you see something that's scary, like a rat or a cockroach, then the id could kick in, and then it takes a bit longer for the ego to kick in, and then it takes even longer for the higher altruistic loving values to kick in, is Freud's theory. Freud, of course, read ancient history too, and he may have been drawing on ancient myths and ancient ideas from Plato and Aristotle that we'll look at next week. So the ego is the agency, that active part of the person. The id is the lowest part, how you feel about it. And then the superego is the highest ideals. And what I think this tells us psychologically is that it's important that you own every part of yourself. Can anyone tell me what goes wrong? So you've got a student who's thinking bad thoughts about little Johnny next to him because he's poked him 5 times already. And you as a teacher tell him, student, get over that. Even though he's poked you 5 times, forget about it, move on. What's wrong with that approach, getting over our negative feelings and emotions? Yeah.
Are you saying yes to me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it goes into your subconscious, so you don't actually deal with like the emotion or the hurt or frustration.
Yeah.
So it just kind of turns into a bit of like a bit of bitterness, and then eventually it'll just fester into this ugly little thing, and then you'll just be angry.
Yeah, very well said. So it'll build up inside and it'll get hardened like a scar, and it can become bitterness. And so there's going to be huge problems building up there. So we're better to get the student to talk it through rather than to hide it. However, you want them to talk it through for 5 or 10 minutes and then get on with things. You don't want them talking it through for 7 days running, for 10 hours a day. There's a problem if you've got to do that. Someone has said in counselling that if you've got a problem, then deal with it maybe for 10 or 15 minutes once a week. So let's say little Johnny's annoyed you, then you might talk it through with someone, write down, little Johnny annoys me, these are the 5 reasons, and little Johnny's my teacher, and so my teacher really annoys me or whatever, and so you write that. But then you might want to put that aside and not look at that for 7 days, because you've got to get on with life. And so you've got to package up the things that give you trouble, but you don't totally bury them. So the ego is the executive function, which mediates, makes decisions, makes choices. And then the superego is the high thoughts, and then the id is the lower thoughts. Can I get everyone to stop thinking for 30 seconds? And then can I while you're not thinking, what are some of the thoughts that come into your mind? So from the SPCF room, what are some thoughts that come into your mind as you stop thinking? What are some thoughts there?
My brain just started all of a sudden thinking over, I can't stop thinking.
How do you stop thinking?
I can't stop thinking.
Yeah. So you go into a cycle and all of these things just keep coming into your mind. this led to a global workspace theory by Bernard Baars, and lots of others have written on this as well, is that your brain has like a conscious spotlight that tries to focus on things, and it's like a theatre that allows certain actors on, and the spotlight comes on to the actor, and there's a lot going on there. So really, the ego is the spotlight that focuses on certain things. And when they've studied the brain, they know that there's a certain part of the brain in the thalamus region and the hypothalamus region that makes decisions about what you focus on. And then there are other parts of the brain that store your bad memories about little Johnny, and your bad memories about what you're afraid of, and your bad memories about how you got to react to snakes and cockroaches and things. So all of that's there, and you have the thinking part of the brain. But this reminds us that in a classroom, we're telling students to focus on the maths we're teaching, but there is a lot more going on in their brain. And just like when I ask you to stop thinking, you can't stop thinking. And so if someone comes from a poor background, and if they're worried about food, they've got a family situation going on at home, but mum, dad are fighting, and someone's ill, and grandma's ill, all of these things are coming into their brain, and they're trying to get the spotlight in their brain, the ego, to focus, but the id is coming up. Whereas someone from a more middle class family, they're able to think higher, more positive thoughts about classical music, and there's all sorts of things coming into their mind. So you've got a lot going on in the classroom. So a summary from SPCEF first and then others. What are some of the main things that we've learned in this first hour about thinking?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is the Freud's theory of personality. Looking at that with the iceberg and the diagram you've got up now of the theatre, just understanding, as you brought into it, with students can't just switch off, and that's pretty much almost a wake-up call, where it's like one of those things we assume we know, but we don't. Just of knowing that students can't just switch off and focus all the time straight on. You give them space to do that.
Yeah, I like that. You can't just switch off. The conscious spotlight, you're trying to bring it back on the maths problem, but things are going on at home, things are going on outside, and you can't just switch off. You're trying to find words to express yourself, and the only words that you get from home, if they're only swearing and negative, then you can't find the language to use as well. Whereas the person from the middle class has got these big words with lots of syllables. They've got different things going on in their mind as well. Someone else from SPCF? Yep, Stephanie, your thoughts take home from what we've picked up?
I think it involves a lot more than I originally thought. It's not just considering a subject, but it's so much more about like all these different influences, your subconscious, your feelings, your context, your society. There's a lot that goes into it and affects how we think and how that comes about. So yeah.
And building on that, Bernard Baars said there's an audience. That is, when you're on stage and acting, you're appealing to the audience, and the students may not think the teacher is the important audience. They may think being a comedian to the others next to them is the important audience, or they may not think their parents is the important audience. They won't see them for another 3 or 4 hours. And so he raises questions of the audience and what they're expecting around you. Memories are also there. Josie, any thoughts on what you see we've learned in this first 1 hour session?
Yeah, definitely. At the beginning, when you were asking us what thinking was, the first thing that sort of came to my mind was it's like a process. But now looking at it like this and seeing that I knew that it was something complex and something that we were still trying to understand, but being able to see that there is so much that that's in it just is pretty amazing to me. Like, I find it so interesting to see that it's more than we realize. We think, like, when we think, it's almost an automatic reaction, but really there's so much that goes into it, and I find that really interesting.
And wouldn't that be a good exercise to do sometime in your classroom, is to draw a bit of a diagram and just draw a typical student in the middle of the class or the back of the class, and then make a list of 20 or 30 influences going into the mind of that student as they sit there. You know, memories of what their parents have said, thoughts that are coming in visually. What are the visual images coming in? And there might be some good diagrams up at the front of the class room. What are the sounds that are coming in? The lawnmower outside. What are the different things the body is telling me about, you know, food or different things there. So it'd be a useful exercise. So let's take a 7-minute or so break there from 9:31 through to about 9:40. So we'll come back about 9:40 and we'll look further at thinking about thinking. So we'll be thinking further about thinking.
Sorry, Sam. I just had a question.
Yeah.
This document, will we have access to that at all, just to kind of look over the stuff for today?
Yeah, I can put this document on to the week one, so I can do that. As well, our video I'll put up sometime today from this class. This video we've got to discussing Freud a bit more. The Monday class didn't discuss that much at all. Wednesday class did discuss that a bit more, and we've discussed it most. So I'll put this video up, and then I might put the Wednesday video up, which could be slightly different, and you could look at either or both of those if you wish. So I can put the document up and the video up, and I might put 2 or 3 documents up as well. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
And then the other thing to do, because it'll be up on video, you'll be able to stop it at different points and gather different notes off. And then, as 1 or 2 people have done, if you want to use your iPhone or something, take a picture of the screenshot as we go through, then that's possible as well. One of the things you might want to do is to build a resource file of resources, but also you might want to, as you take notes, just highlight or colour in what are the key take-home ideas that excite you. And you could even go to Google or Google Scholar and put in some of those key ideas, like if Freud and his views got you interested, you could you know, build up a bit of a file there on that and have a glance at it. Sounds good? See you after the break.
Are you guys using browsers?
What is computers?
And if you have any more questions after the break as well, certainly bring them up. Happy to answer those.